In criminal justice systems remains a global concern, with Africans and people of African descent disproportionately represented in prisons and detention facilities across multiple countries. A new report by the UN International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement highlights the role of historical legacies, racial stereotypes, and structural biases in perpetuating these disparities. The report also offers practical recommendations, including racial and cultural impact assessments, sentence reviews, and alternatives to incarceration. Joining us this morning to discuss the report's findings and what can be done to address these injustices is Dr. Tracie Keese, a member of the UN Expert Mechanism based in the U.S. city of Denver. Dr. Keese, thank you for joining us. How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for your invitation.
Our pleasure. So let's start here. Then the UN has just released this report highlighting systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent in criminal justice systems worldwide. Could you briefly explain what the main findings are and why they matter now?
Thank you again. And some of the main findings in the report are findings that are not new, and especially new to those of African and African descent. When we look at the disproportionate numbers of folks that are incarcerated, when we talk about how historical colonialism has created narratives and criminalization of actions of those of African and African descent, when we look at courts and we look at trials and the outcomes and the disproportionate amount of sentencing and time that is given, again, we have overrepresentation of those who are incarcerated. We also take a look at those things that are in the intersection. So when we talk about specifically women and girls and the way that their bodies are criminalized and how they're treated. And so we know that these issues that we are bringing up in this report are not new. And the urgency is that as we see around the world, where we get this sense of a rollback on a lot of the work that has been done to try to eliminate what we believe are those still standing structural and systemic issues.
The report points to overrepresentation of Africans and people of African descent in prisons and detention facilities specifically. What structural or institutional factors are driving this overrepresentation?
Well, there's a couple things that we can look at, right? So we can look at the issue of the ability to have bond or to get out or pre-trial. We also look at those issues where folks do not have representation, so they do not have attorneys or there isn't one that is provided for them. But we also have to look at low-level criminal activity that often is one that we see African and African descent jailed more on. So if we talk about racial profiling, we talk about traffic stops. We also talk about the mental health needs of folks that are overly incarcerated. We have a lot of folks that are incarcerated that have mental health issues, and we know not just in one particular country, but many countries where we find our prisons to be some of the largest holders of those of mental health and have the least amount of services to provide for people. So we then find this sort of reaction of trying to hold people in place who really need to be treated. So there's always a number of factors there. And one of the things that we also like to identify is it's not just the criminal justice system. There are other systems that are intersecting with this work. So if we look at the social determinants that we talk about of crime, we talk about lack of housing, education, joblessness, health. All of those things intersect and also feed into the overrepresentation and incarceration.
So the report mentions these racial stereotypes influencing even decisions by police, prosecutors, and judges. Can you give examples of how these biases manifest in everyday justice processes? And I'm interested in your own experience as having been within the police yourself.
One of the things that we have to be careful about, especially as an officer and retired, and whether you're in the judicial system, and to your point, it's not just law enforcement. One of the things that we also have to be very careful about is how we are learning about other people, right? So when we talk about culture, we talk about lived experiences, we have to also be careful not to bring our own stereotypical judgments into, for example, who can be rehabilitated and who can't, who is a criminal and who is not. Do you fit a specific profile? And all of these things that we talk about that are making the connection, and we know this from our research and from science, that the quickest connection of criminality is made for those of African and African descent, specifically males, and even more so now as we talk about our young girls. And so one of the things we have to make sure we look at is when we have a system, we need to have a system that understands that there are folks with special needs and different approaches that need to be taken. And law enforcement learns this in the academy. We want to make sure that they have not just training, but are held accountable if those kinds of biases are showing up. And the same in the court system for our judiciary and our attorneys. They also will need to be trained, and you also have to monitor and collect data to make sure that we are identifying those disparities and that we can go in and take a look and see what is causing those. But we also know that decision making, for example, plays a part of that, and we talk about diversion. So oftentimes there'll be programs that will divert folks away from the criminal justice system. And when we look at that data, we often see that folks of African and African descent are the least folks, or the last folks, if any, that are offered those types of programs. So it shows up in very many ways. And one of the things that we have to make sure is that we have accountability mechanisms in place, that we select and train officers. We also make sure that we have judiciary understanding not just what their roles are, but giving them additional options to work with. So there's really multiple ways we can do that. But a lot of times, especially in policing, those stereotypes and who you believe to be a criminal and not often will creep in. And in addition to that, what will happen is that you'll have an event that confirms what you may believe, although that is not correct, right? So we call that confirmation bias. You may find, and most of us can find different things to line up with what we believe. And that's why it's very important that data is collected throughout the system so we can always make sure that we're checking and creating or trying some types of remedies to see if they're working at all.
You touch on an issue of culture. How do historical legacies such as colonialism and segregation continue to influence modern law enforcement and judicial practices?
Oh, what a wonderful question, right? So we have to start from the beginning and talk about the way that those of African descent, those who were very much a part of that transatlantic slave trade, but just how the social construct of what Blackness looks like and how it behaves. And we see a lot of that in the early stages of putting these systems together. When we're talking about who has got the aptitude or is smart enough to make decisions or not be involved in crime, we still have those things that are sort of threaded through some of not just our legislature, but also some of our laws. And oftentimes what you'll have happen is you'll say, well, we have a group that's for some reason can't be rehabilitated. And we used to hear that a lot, right? We heard that in the early stages that there had to be something special or something different. And we also have to bring back into, once you start socially constructing a narrative around groups of people, you also have to add into it, for example, when we talk about housing and where folks live and the ability not to live in a food desert, to have health and be able to get access to medicine. And we often know this through our entire lifetime and in our history that these are things that are often either less than or not appropriate, or they do not address our needs the way that we're experiencing them. So we are still continuing to follow these social constructed narratives around what it means to be those of African descent or those who are walking in their Blackness. And we always say this, it's racial profiling, like walking while Black, shopping while Black. You can add any of those things to it. But we still see a lot of those pieces of keeping folks segregated and making sure that whatever old narratives people are still relying on show up. And that also goes through to who can be rehabilitated, who cannot. So we see a lot of those things still. And I think it's extremely important that we don't lose sight of our history, but we also make sure that we focus on what should we be doing moving forward and making sure that it's evidence-based and that we make sure that it is working.
The 12 key elements that are outlined in this report, these are for eliminating systemic racism in justice systems. We won't have time to go through all of them, but which one of them do you think would be best suited and the one that can give the most immediate impact if implemented?
Well, they're all important. And I wouldn't say that we would have to pick one or the other. I would share with you that there are some that have already begun and they've already been in place sometimes for decades. But probably one of the bigger ones for me is community's participation and centering community in what the needs are to be safe and what does that look like. In addition to having services close to the ground, close to home, close to the neighborhoods, close to villages, where you're not on buses for 2.5 hours trying to figure out where you need to be and what you need to do as well. Data collection is also key because it allows us to begin to focus in on the things that we need to pay attention to. And it's not just data collection for data collection's sake, it's disaggregated data. And we still have a lot of states that do not collect data, do not collect racial data. And they have varying reasons why not. But again, the use of that data to be able to identify exactly where the issues are. And then, of course, I would say the equal access to justice, right? How is justice defined and how do you get to that? How do you get reparations for victims and for survivors? So there's not just one that I think is more important than the other, but all of these things have to work together.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we have to remember is oftentimes we try to do one at a time as opposed to looking at an entire system and having things working simultaneously. And that includes having the will to make the changes and to get things done, to put them in place. So I think all of them are extremely important. But I also would say that we often think we have to do one at a time before we can get to the business at hand. And one of the things that we should be doing all the time is assessing what our priorities are and then how do we shift if we need to make sure we address those issues.
Right.
But I
Dr.
would
Keese,
tell you
we're
the
gonna
12
leave
key
it there.
elements, all of them are important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dr. Tracie Keese, a member of the UN International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, joining us live from Denver in the United States. Let's get in touch with our news headlines now. It's 7:31 Central African Time. Here's Onele Nzinzi.
SABC News.